Look, sometimes you do things that seem perfectly reasonable in the moment, and then everyone acts like you've committed some unforgivable sin. Before you judge me, before you paint me as the villain in this story, you have to understand the full picture. My name is Alara, I'm 23, and the narrative that's been spun about what happened with my boyfriend Griffin is so twisted that I barely recognize myself in it. The truth is, I was just trying to survive. To understand why I needed Griffin's apartment like I needed air, you'd have to understand the hellscape I was escaping. Living with my mother, Cheryl, wasn't just unpleasant, it was a slow-motion demolition of the soul. Her apartment was a museum of neglect, smelling perpetually of stale cigarette smoke and the faint, sweet rot of forgotten takeout containers. Bills with angry red letters were stacked on every surface, monuments to her inability to hold down a job or manage a single dollar. Cheryl was a ghost haunting her own life, fueled by cheap vodka and a bottomless well of self-pity. Her favorite pastime was rewriting history to make me the source of all her problems. Her addiction? A response to the stress of raising me. Her unemployment? My fault for being a financial burden. The woman was a black hole of responsibility, and I was caught in her gravitational pull. The worst part was the stealing. It wasn't brazen, it was insidious. A 20 from my wallet here, a 10 from my bedside table there. When confronted, she'd either deny it with the conviction of a seasoned liar or break down into theatrical sobs about how desperate she was, making me feel monstrous for even asking. The night that changed everything, the one that propelled me into Griffin's life, she took $40 while I slept. It was the last of my cash, money I'd earmarked for gas to get to work for the rest of the week. When I discovered it was gone, something inside me didn't just break, it shattered. I called Griffin, my voice choked with a kind of desperate rage I didn't know I possessed. We had only been dating for 6 months, but Griffin was my anchor. He was 26, with a quiet confidence that I found incredibly soothing. He had his own place, a simple one-bedroom apartment. Nothing fancy, but it was his. It was clean. It was safe. It was everything my home wasn't. When I told him what happened, his voice was soft but firm. "You can't stay there anymore, Alara. Come stay with me. Just for a while. We'll figure it out." I cried with relief. I wasn't trying to move in permanently. I swore to him and to myself. I just needed a sanctuary, a place to breathe and get my feet back under me. He was so sweet about it, clearing out a few drawers for me in his dresser and making space in the closet without a single complaint. He said I could stay as long as I needed. He said we'd figure it out together. And for the first month, it was perfect. It felt like playing house in the best possible way. We fell into a comfortable rhythm. Griffin would wake up early for his job in IT and make coffee, the rich smell filling the small apartment. I'd straighten up during the day, doing the dishes, laundry, making the place feel a little more like a home. It was the first time in my life I'd experienced a healthy, stable domestic routine. It felt normal. It felt like what a real relationship was supposed to be. I felt safe, cared for, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally relax. I was in love, not just with him, but with the peace he represented. It was a fragile peace, but I clung to it like a life raft. The sanctuary began to feel less like a haven, and more like a gilded cage when my own life started to unravel. My job at the retail boutique became an absolute nightmare. My boss was a woman who seemed to derive her life force from the misery of others. She would hover, her critiques like tiny paper cuts, until my confidence was in shreds. She scheduled me for erratic shifts, making it impossible to plan anything, to have any semblance of a life outside of folding sweaters and upselling accessories. The final straw came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was busy, a line of customers snaking back to the dressing rooms. I was trying to ring up a purchase efficiently when she stormed over, her face a mask of fury. "You forgot to ask her about the store credit card, Alara," she shrieked, right there in front of everyone. The customer stared. I stared. The entire store went quiet. In that moment, a wave of clarity washed over me. I wasn't going to be humiliated for minimum wage. I looked at my boss, at her contorted face, and I simply took off my name tag, placed it on the counter, and walked out. I didn't say a word. The silence I left behind was more satisfying than any comeback I could have mustered. I felt a surge of liberation as I walked out into the sunshine. But when I told Griffin what had happened, his reaction wasn't the unconditional support I had expected. His brow furrowed. You just walked out? Without anything else lined up? I explained the toxic environment, the public humiliation. He seemed to get it, nodding along, but there was a new tension in his shoulders. Okay, he said slowly. Just start looking for something else right away, all right? I promised him I would, and I meant it. I really did. But job hunting is a soul-crushing endeavor. I spent days scrolling through listings, sending out resumes into the digital void. The responses were disheartening: more minimum-wage retail jobs, call centers that sounded like factories for despair. Why should I jump from one toxic environment to another? I reasoned that it was better to take a little time, to find something that was actually worth my time and energy. A week bled into a month, and then a month slid into 2. I'd apply for a job here and there, but my heart wasn't in it. And that's when the cracks in my sanctuary started to show. Griffin never raised his voice, never explicitly told me to hurry up. It was more subtle than that. It was in the way he'd sigh when opening the electricity bill. It was a certain tone that crept into his voice when he'd ask, "Any luck with the job search today?" It wasn't mean, but it was heavy. It was the weight of him covering all the rent, all the utilities, all the groceries. I felt guilty, of course I did, but I also felt a simmering resentment. It felt like his support was conditional, tied to my financial contribution. I was going through a hard time, and instead of feeling his unwavering emotional support, I felt his financial stress. It made me feel like a burden. That was when my past decided to send a text message. It was from Dalton, my ex from the year before. We'd only dated for a couple of months before I realized he was suffocatingly clingy. He needed constant reassurance, and his emotions were a roller coaster I had no desire to ride. I ended things by simply stopping. I ghosted him. It wasn't my proudest moment, but he wasn't the kind of guy who took no for an answer. His text was unexpected. "Hey, been thinking about you. Hope you're doing well." At first, I ignored it, but then another one came a few days later. A long paragraph about how he'd matured, how he understood why I left, and how he just missed talking to me as a friend. I was feeling isolated and unappreciated. Griffin was all about bills and work stress. We barely talked about anything deep anymore. Dalton's message, misguided as it might have been, felt like a lifeline. It was from someone who, right now, seemed to want nothing from me except my conversation. Someone who actually seemed to appreciate me. Against my better judgment, I typed back, "Hey, it's been a while. I'm okay, thanks for asking." It was a small, seemingly innocent act, but it was the first stone I dislodged in the foundation of the life I was trying to build with Griffin. What started as a single text message soon bloomed into a constant stream of conversation. Dalton was a master at being exactly what I needed in that moment. When I vented about my fruitless job search, he offered practical advice and offered to run mock interviews with me. When I hinted at the tension with Griffin, he listened without judgment, making me feel seen and heard in a way I felt Griffin no longer did. He remembered little things: my favorite kind of coffee, a book I'd mentioned wanting to read. It was intoxicating. After a week of nonstop texting, he suggested we grab coffee. "Just as friends," he wrote. "Catch up properly, my treat." I hesitated for only a moment. Griffin was at work all day. I was bored and lonely. What was the harm? "It's just coffee," I told myself, the first of many justifications I would construct to wall off my guilt. The coffee shop became our regular spot. Once a week, then twice. I'd make sure I was home long before Griffin, the apartment clean, dinner planned. I wasn't hiding it, I reasoned. I just didn't see the point in causing unnecessary drama. Griffin was already stressed. Why make him worry about something that was completely innocent? But it wasn't completely innocent, and a part of me knew it. The way Dalton looked at me across the small table was the way Griffin used to look at me, with an intensity that made me feel like I was the only person in the world. There were small, electric moments that blurred the lines of friendship. Our hands would brush when we both reached for a sugar packet. He'd sit a little closer than necessary when showing me something on his phone, his arm pressing against mine. I never pulled away. He started asking more questions about Griffin. "Is it serious? Are you happy?" And I found myself confiding in him, telling him things I couldn't say to Griffin. I complained about how Griffin seemed more like a landlord than a boyfriend lately, how his stress over money made me feel small and inadequate. I told Dalton that living with Griffin was always meant to be temporary, just a stopgap until I figured out my next move. Technically, none of it was a lie. It was all true, from a certain carefully curated perspective. I was figuring things out. But I knew how Dalton would interpret it. I knew he was hearing what he wanted to hear, that I was available. I never explicitly told him he was wrong. The whole time, I was living a double life. In the evenings, I was Griffin's supportive girlfriend, asking about his day, cooking his favorite meals, sleeping in his bed. But during the day, I was someone else. I was Alara, the fascinating, complicated woman that Dalton was so captivated by. I was feeding off his attention, and it felt good. It filled a void I hadn't wanted to admit was there. My internal monologue was a masterclass in self-deception. Griffin and I never had the exclusivity talk, I told myself. We were living together out of convenience, a solution to my housing crisis, not a solemn vow of lifelong commitment. I cared about Griffin, of course I did. But life is complicated. Relationships are complicated. And a smart woman, a survivor, always keeps her options open. I was just being smart. I was just surviving. It was a dangerous game, juggling these two versions of my life, but I was so sure I could manage it. I was so sure I had it all under control. The illusion of control shattered on a Thursday night. The day had been unremarkable. I'd spent the afternoon at the library, feigning a productive job search, followed by an hour-long coffee meeting with Dalton that felt more charged than ever before. He'd held my hand for a moment too long when we said goodbye, his eyes pleading. I pulled away, but the spark of it lingered on my skin. That evening, Griffin and I were curled up in bed, his laptop balanced between us as we watched some mindless sitcom. It was a perfectly normal scene, the kind of quiet domesticity I once craved. The air was peaceful. And then came the banging. It wasn't a knock. It was an aggressive, frantic pounding on the front door that vibrated through the floor. My stomach didn't just drop, it plummeted. A cold, nauseating certainty washed over me. I knew, with absolute dread, who it was. Griffin looked at me, confused. "Are you expecting someone?" I shook my head, my mouth suddenly dry. "Number. Maybe it's the wrong apartment." He slid out of bed, pulling on a t-shirt. "I'll go check." I sat frozen, listening to the floorboards creak as he walked to the door. I heard the click of the deadbolt, the groan of the door opening, and then a voice I recognized with horror. "Dalton's." It was choked with a pathetic, dramatic anguish. "Why haven't you been answering my texts?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "We need to talk about what happened yesterday." I heard Griffin's low, confused reply. "Sorry, man. I think you have the wrong place." "This is Alara's apartment, isn't it?" Dalton pressed, trying to peer around Griffin. "Alara, I know you're in there." My heart was hammering against my ribs. I scrambled out of bed, my mind racing. Deny everything. He's crazy. He's obsessed. Griffin turned from the door and looked back down the short hallway at me, his face a canvas of pure bewilderment. "Alara, do you know this guy?" Before I could form a coherent lie, Dalton launched into a tirade. "Know him? We've been trying to work things out. I can't believe you're shacking up with this random dude, Alara. What about everything you told me? What about our coffee dates? What about how you said you were going to leave him?" Griffin's face cycled through 5 different emotions in 10 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, suspicion, dawning comprehension, and finally, a deep, quiet hurt. While Dalton kept rambling, weaving a narrative of a rekindled romance, my world was collapsing in slow motion. I found my voice, and it came out as a shrill scream. "Get out of here, Dalton. You're insane. Leave us alone." I rushed towards the door, trying to position myself as the victim of an unhinged ex. "Griffin, he's just an obsessed ex-boyfriend who can't accept that we're over. He's been harassing me for weeks." But Dalton wasn't backing down. He was a man on a mission of self-destruction, and he was taking me with him. "Harassing you? We met for coffee yesterday. You told me he was controlling and boring. You told me you felt trapped." He was shouting specifics, details from our private conversations, things that made it sickeningly clear that this was more than just a case of a crazy ex. The sitcom on the laptop was still playing faintly in the background, a laugh track underscoring the most devastating moment of my life. Griffin, who had been silent until now, finally moved. He stepped towards Dalton, his voice dangerously low. You need to leave. Now. Not until I talk to. Leave now, or I'm calling the police, Griffin said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Dalton seemed to deflate. He looked from Griffin's stony face to my panicked one, and his eyes filled with tears. He was always so dramatic. He mumbled something incoherent and stumbled away down the hallway. Griffin closed the door, the click of the lock echoing in the sudden, deafening silence. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just stood there, his back to the door, and looked at me as if he was seeing a complete stranger for the very first time. The quiet was worse than any shouting match could ever be. It was the sound of trust evaporating into thin air. The interrogation that followed was quiet and methodical, which made it 1,000 times worse than the screaming match I had braced myself for. Griffin sat on the edge of the bed, the place where we were just cuddling moments before, and I stood by the dresser, feeling like a defendant on trial. How did he know where I live? Griffin asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I don't know, I stammered, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. He must have followed me. How long have you two been talking? He's been harassing me, I insisted, my voice trembling, trying to inject some victimhood into it. He texts me constantly. I've been trying to handle it on my own, without dragging you into it. For every question he asked, I constructed a lie, weaving a frantic, flimsy narrative of an obsessed ex and my misguided attempts to protect Griffin from the drama. But my answers were full of holes, and I could see he wasn't buying it. He wasn't getting angry. He was just getting more distant, his eyes becoming colder and more analytical with every pathetic lie I told. We went to bed that night as strangers, a chasm of silence and suspicion between us on the mattress. The next morning, he left for work without saying more than 2 words. The silence he left behind was heavy with unspoken truths. I spent the entire day in a state of panic, rehearsing better lies, more plausible explanations. Maybe I could say Dalton had blackmailed me. Maybe I could say I was trying to help him through a mental health crisis, and he misinterpreted my kindness. I was so deep in my own delusion that I almost convinced myself I could spin this. Griffin came home that evening with a different energy. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was finality. We need to talk, he said, and his voice was chillingly calm. He sat down on the couch and pulled out his phone. Dalton messaged me on social media. My blood ran cold. He sent me a very long explanation, Griffin continued, his eyes fixed on the screen. He sent me screenshots. He turned the phone towards me, and there it was. My entire betrayal, laid out in glowing pixels. Our text conversations. My complaints about him. The one where I called him controlling for asking where I'd been all afternoon. The one where I told Dalton that living with Griffin was just convenient for now. The one where I wrote, he doesn't really get me, not like you do. Seeing my own words, stripped of context and justification, reflected back at me through his phone, made them sound so much harsher, so much more cruel than they had felt when I'd typed them. Is any of this true, Alara? He asked, his voice still quiet, but now it held a tremor of profound pain. I broke down. The lies were useless now. The only thing left was to beg. I sobbed, explaining that Dalton was twisting everything, that I was confused and lonely, that I never meant to hurt him. I reminded him about Cheryl, about how I had nowhere else to go, how grateful I was for him. I told him Dalton meant nothing, that I'd block him everywhere, that I'd get a job tomorrow, that I would do anything to make it up to him. He just kept slowly shaking his head, his eyes distant. I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I can't be in a relationship where I don't know what's real. Don't, I pleaded, grabbing his hand. Don't make any rash decisions. We can work through this. It was one stupid mistake. It's not about Dalton, he said, pulling his hand away gently. It's about the lying. It's about you complaining about me to another guy instead of talking to me. It's about you keeping secrets while I'm supporting you completely. The trust is gone. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were clear and resolved. I need you to move out. The words hit me like a physical blow. Move out? Where? Where am I supposed to go? The panic was real, a tidal wave of terror. You can't just throw me out on the street over some text messages. I never actually cheated. I need you out by the end of the weekend, he said, standing up. The conversation was over. I'm sorry, Alara, but I can't live like this. The next 2 days were a blur of panic and impotent rage. I called my one close friend, Brielle, but she was wrapped up in her own drama and could only offer a couch for a single night. Shelters required intake processes, motels required money I didn't have. My only real option was the one place I'd sworn I'd never return to. On Friday morning, I went out for one last-ditch job interview. When I returned to the apartment, my key wouldn't work. My heart seized. Taped to the door was an envelope with my name on it. Inside, a new key and a short typed note. Alara, I've moved your things outside the door. I've changed the main lock. This new key is for the front door of the building only, so you can get your boxes. Please leave it on the kitchen counter when you're done, Griffin. And there it was. My life. Packed neatly into 5 cardboard boxes and 3 garbage bags, stacked against the wall in the hallway. He'd even packed my toiletries in a separate bag. My few pieces of jewelry were wrapped carefully in tissue paper. The sheer methodical care he had taken felt crueler than any act of rage. It wasn't an eviction born of passion. It was a calm, calculated amputation. He was cutting me out of his life. I waited on the front steps of the building for 2 hours, a pathetic vigil. When his car finally pulled into the parking lot, he looked surprised, but not sympathetic. To see me still there, I stood up, ready to try one last time, to offer one final, desperate plea. He walked past me towards the door, his keys already in hand. Griffin, please, I whispered. He manipulated the whole situation. I never meant to hurt you. He paused at the door but didn't turn to look at me. I hope you figure things out, Alara, he said, his voice quiet. And then he walked inside, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, leaving me alone on the curb with the wreckage of my life packed in cardboard. The phone call to my mother was the most humiliating moment of my life. Her voice was laced with a tired, I told you so sort of malice. She took 2 hours to arrive in her beat-up sedan, complaining about the cost of gas the entire time. The drive back to her apartment was a silent symphony of her sighs and muttered comments about how I never learn. Being back in that apartment, with its familiar smell of cigarettes and disappointment, felt like the ultimate defeat. The black hole had pulled me back in. Life with Cheryl was even worse than I remembered. Within a week, she was back to her old tricks, borrowing money I didn't have and blaming me for her problems. Dalton, true to form, didn't disappear. He seemed to think Griffin's absence was his grand entrance cue. He blew up my phone, my social media, my email, convinced that he had saved me and that now we could be together. I was furious with him. If he'd just kept his mouth shut, if he hadn't shown up like a deranged character in a soap opera, I could have managed it. I blocked him on everything, but he kept finding new ways to reach out, a persistent ghost I couldn't exorcise. His obsessive behavior was a chilling reminder of why I'd left him in the first place. The urgent need for a job became my sole focus. I finally landed one at a call center. The work was mind-numbing, a monotonous cycle of placating angry customers and reading from a script. But it was a paycheck. It was a start. It was my first step on the long, arduous climb out of the hole I was in. 3 months after Griffin kicked me out, I was scrolling through my phone on my lunch break when I saw it. He had updated his relationship status to single. Seeing it there, in official Facebook terms, made it feel more final than the boxes in the hallway. A few weeks after that, my friend Brielle mentioned she'd run into him at the grocery store. He seemed really good, Alara, she said, her tone cautious. Like, really happy, relaxed. Like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. She didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear. He's better off without you. Even my own friend seemed to be taking his side. The final twist of the knife came a month later. Through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances, I heard he was seeing someone new. 4 months. That's all the time it took for him to replace me. She was a woman from his office, I heard. Stable, probably boring. The kind of woman who would never create complications, never have a messy life, never need to be rescued. The kind of woman who wouldn't have understood what I'd been through. It's been 8 months now since that night. I have my own place, a tiny studio apartment that's barely big enough for a bed and a table, but it's mine. The call center job led to a slightly better administrative position at a different company. I'm paying my own bills. I'm independent. But I still think Griffin completely overreacted. I lie awake some nights, replaying the events, and all I can see is his betrayal, not my own. Yes, I was talking to Dalton, and yes, maybe I said some things I shouldn't have, but I never actually cheated. I never had any intention of leaving Griffin for Dalton. The whole thing was a misunderstanding, a rough patch that got blown out of proportion because Dalton was unstable and Griffin was unwilling to fight for us. 6 months we were together, and he couldn't even try to work through one complicated situation. He just labeled me untrustworthy and threw everything away. If he had really loved me, he would have seen my desperation, my confusion. He would have been willing to go to therapy, to talk it through, to give me a chance to earn back his trust. Instead, he chose the easy way out. He chose to cut me loose. This whole mess taught me a lot about Griffin's true character. He's not the supportive, understanding man he pretends to be. He's a man who turns cold and unforgiving the moment things get difficult. In a way, maybe I dodged a bullet. Maybe I found out who he really was before I wasted even more of my life on him. People who know the story, people like Brielle, seem to think I'm the bad guy. But they don't get it. They don't know the crushing weight of living with someone like Cheryl. They don't know how isolating it felt when Griffin's support started to feel conditional. They don't see how Dalton manipulated the situation, or how Griffin refused to even listen to my side of the story before passing his final judgment. I'm not saying I'm perfect. Maybe I should have been more upfront about Dalton, but people make mistakes. Real relationships are supposed to be resilient enough to survive a few bumps in the road. The fact that ours wasn't tells me everything I need to know about what kind of partner Griffin would have been long-term. Now, I'm focused on myself. I'm building my own stability, a foundation that no one can kick me out of. I'm not looking for another relationship. I've learned that people will inevitably disappoint you. I survived my mother's chaos. I survived Griffin's rejection. I'm stronger now. This whole experience taught me that you can't rely on anyone else to save you. You have to be your own sanctuary. You have to save yourself. It's a harsh lesson, but at least it's real. And that's something no one can ever take away from me.